On the night of the 11th of August, 1784, a little after 11, the Cardinal of France knelt in a dark hedge in the gardens of Versailles, took the hem of a pale rose gown between his fingers, pressed it to his lips, and was given a rose by a woman he believed to be the Queen. The woman was a Paris prostitute hired for 15,000 livres. The Queen was asleep in her apartments at Trianon, on the other side of the park, and did not know the meeting had occurred. The Cardinal was holding the hem of the gown for 140 seconds. In those 140 seconds, and this is what Buneau afterwards wrote, and what I have come to believe, the Bourbon throne lost the necklace, the country, and in due course, the Queen's head. Her name was Jeanne. She was 28. She had begun life as a barefoot child on the road outside Bar-sur-Aube, saying one sentence over and over to passing carriages. And she had ended, at 35, on the pavement of a London street with 3 ribs broken and a strip of gilded ribbon in her pocket. Between the road and the pavement, she would forge the Queen's signature, defraud a prince of the church, break a diamond collar of 2,842 carats into pieces small enough to be sold one by one in Northern Europe, and be branded in public on the steps of the Conciergerie. Marie Antoinette would never, in the 7 years that remained to her, recover. This story has been told as a swindle. It is not, in the end, a swindle. It is a story about a carriage that did not have to stop on a country road in 1763, and about what one woman did with 23 years of having been let in. The pair in this story are real, both of them. The dialogue between them is a reconstruction in the spirit of the depositions taken before the Parlement de Paris in the spring of 1786, and the memoirs of Madame Campan, who served the Queen and afterwards wrote down what she had seen. Where the depositions and the memoirs disagree, I follow the depositions and say so. Before any of it, there was a necklace. The crown jeweler of France stood in his shop on the Quai des Orfèvres in March of 1774 and lifted a single diamond out of a velvet tray with a pair of brass tweezers, and he wept. He was a man of 50 who had spent 6 years buying stones in Amsterdam, in London, in Antwerp, and once, in person, in a back room in Lisbon, where the air smelled of cinnamon and old gunpowder. The stone weighed 11 carats. The collar he had been building around it weighed 2,842. The king for whom it had been ordered, Louis XV, had died of smallpox at Versailles 2 months earlier. The mistress for whom the king had ordered it, the Comtesse du Barry, had been packed into a carriage at 6 in the morning the day after the king's death and driven to the abbey at Pont-aux-Dames, where she would, by the new queen's instruction, learn to embroider altar cloths and pennants. And Charles Auguste Boehmer held a diamond he could not sell and could not melt and could not, without ruin, eat. He put the stone back. He closed the tray. He wrote that afternoon to his partner Bassange in Amsterdam, in a hand that the recipient afterwards described as the hand of a man who has been very tired for a long time. We are ruined unless the new queen wears it. She did not wear it. She refused it in March of 1775. She refused it again in 1778, after the birth of Madame Royale. She refused it a third time in 1781, after she had given the king his dauphin, and she sat for 2 hours with Boehmer in the small cabinet beside her bedchamber and listened to him say, in a French softened by his German childhood, that he would have to break the collar and sell the stones one by one in the cities of Northern Europe. And the Queen had said, with that small, distracted kindness that her detractors called insolence and her women called grief, "Then break it, Monsieur Boehmer. I have ships I would rather have." And Boehmer had not broken it. He had borrowed instead. He had borrowed in Vienna. He had borrowed in Amsterdam. He had borrowed from a Genoese house whose name appears in the dossier of the police in 1786, and nowhere else in the records I have read. The interest alone, by the spring of 1784, was eating his shop. And then, in the summer of that year, a woman whose existence he had been ignoring for 2 years walked into his life carrying a name she did not legally own, and a story that turned out to be the only thing that could move a diamond collar that no queen would touch. The pair in this story are real, both of them. The dialogue between them is a reconstruction in the spirit of the depositions taken before the Parlement de Paris in the spring of 1786, and the memoirs of Madame Campan, who served the Queen and afterwards wrote down what she had seen. Where the depositions and the memoirs disagree, I follow the depositions and say so. Her name, as she signed it, was Jeanne de Saint-Remy de Valois, Comtesse de la Motte. Of the 4 pieces of that title, 3 were a lie, and 1 was not. The Valois were real. They had been kings of France until 1589. The line had ended when Henri III was knifed in a courtyard at St. Cloud by a friar with a kitchen knife, and the kingdom had gone to the Bourbons, and the Valois had subsided into history. They had subsided everywhere except in one small line that descended from an illegitimate son of Henri II by a Picard noblewoman named Nicole de Savigny in 1557. The boy had been recognized by his father in an act of 1573. He had been given the seigneury of Saint-Remy. He had been given the right to call himself a Valois. He had not been given any money. By the time his descendants reached the 18th century, they were the kind of family who slept in their last good coat and sold the silver buckles off their shoes to pay for bread. Jeanne was born to that family at Fontet in Champagne in July of 1756. Her father, Jacques, called himself Baron de Saint-Remy, signed his name as such, and could prove the descent in 3 documents he kept rolled in oiled paper in a wooden box. He could prove nothing else. The family lived in a stone cottage near Bar-sur-Aube on a holding that produced perhaps 40 livres a year. There were 5 children. There was no school. There was, by all later accounts, a great deal of shouting. Jeanne was the second. She was small, fierce, and watchful. By her 7th year, she had a particular trick which her mother, who, by the family's later account, was a sluttish woman who left her husband twice and beat her children on principle, had taught her without meaning to. She would walk along the road south of Bar-sur-Aube, where the carriages of the gentry of Champagne passed on their way to take the waters at Bourbon. She would walk barefoot, in a shift, with her hair tangled. And when a carriage slowed at the rise where the horses had to be rested, she would step out of the verge in front of it and say one sentence, which she had been taught to say in French and not in the Champenois patois, which was the family's first language. She would say, "Take pity on a little orphan of the blood of the Valois." By her 7th year, this had become her work. Her mother sent her out at dawn. She came back at evening with a sou, 2 sous, occasionally a sol from a kindly priest, and once, from an old man who got out of his carriage to look at her face, a piece of gilded ribbon, which she kept for the rest of her life, and which was found among her papers in London in 1791. I want to stop here because the next sentence in this story is the sentence on which the entire necklace turns, and it needs to be set down clearly. In July of 1763, when Jeanne was 7, a carriage stopped on that same road. The woman who got out of it was the Marquise de Boulainvilliers, the wife of the Marquis de Boulainvilliers, who was at that time prévôt of Paris. She had been at the waters at Bourbon. She was driving home. She got out because her footman had told her that there was a child in the road who could not be moved without being run over. Jeanne said her sentence. The Marquise, and here I am following the deposition Jeanne herself gave 23 years later, which is the only source for this exchange, and which must be read with the kind of care one gives to any story told by an accused woman who needs to explain who she became. The Marquise looked at her for a long moment. She said, "Show me your hands." Jeanne showed her hands. They were the hands of a child who had been picking stones out of a fallow field. They were not the hands of any kind of beggar one had ever seen. The Marquise said, "Show me the document." Jeanne, who had been instructed to carry one of her father's 3 copies in the lining of her shift in case anyone ever asked, took it out. The Marquise read it. The Marquise read it twice. She handed it back. She said, "Get into the carriage." That is the moment. That, in the deposition, is the moment. A 7-year-old girl who has been walking barefoot in July, who has had nothing to eat since dawn except a heel of bread her brother stole for her, gets into a carriage with a Marquise she has never seen, on the strength of a single document and a single sentence, and is driven away from the road outside Bar-sur-Aube to a house in Passy, where she is washed and fed and put into a bed with sheets. She did not see her mother again for 2 years. When she did see her mother again, in 1765 in Paris, her mother was a beggar in the Rue Saint-Honoré, and Jeanne, who was now 9 and dressed in the cast-off clothes of the Marquise's own daughter, was made to walk past her without recognition. The Marquise had explained, in the carriage, that this was the only way the new life could be made to hold. For 10 years, the Marquise paid for everything. She paid for the school at Longchamp, where the daughters of impoverished noble houses were taught to be useful, to speak good French, to write a clear hand, to embroider, to play a polite piece on the harpsichord, to nurse the sick, and read aloud to the dying. She paid for the dowry when the king himself, on petition, granted Jeanne and her younger sister the pension of 800 livres a year that came to all recognized descendants of the legitimized Valois bastard line. The Marquise paid because it amused her to do so. She paid because she had, at 50, a daughter of her own who was sweet and unintelligent, and she had found in this small child from Bar-sur-Aube something she had not found in her own house, which was a kind of grave attention. She paid because the world, she said once at table within Jean's hearing, was a place in which a girl with the blood of Valois ought not to be a beggar. She did not say that the blood of Valois in that quantity and through that line was worth in the 18th century almost exactly nothing. And Jean, who heard her say it, and who watched her bring out the document to show her dinner guests, and who watched the dinner guests examine it with the slow, careful interest with which a man examines a coin he is not sure is genuine, Jean understood, by 12, by 13, by 15, that the only thing in her life that worked was the document, that without it, she would still be on the road outside Bar-sur-Aube, that with it doors opened, but not the doors she could see, the doors of Versailles, of the Queen's antechamber, of the bedchamber of the King, were not opened by a single sheet of parchment of 1573. They were opened by money, by introduction, by the indulgence of an established mistress, by the favor of an aunt who was a lady-in-waiting, by 10 things Jeanne did not have and the Marquise de Boulainvilliers, for all her kindness, could not give her. The Marquise died in 1781. Jeanne was 25. The pension of 800 livres a year had been confirmed by the king. It was not enough to live on in Paris as a Valois. She had married, the year before the Marquise's death, a man named Marc-Antoine Nicolas de la Motte. The marriage had been the Marquise's last gift, and a poisoned one. La Motte was a gendarme of the King's Guard. He had no fortune and no title. He claimed descent from a noble family of Champagne. The claim was not provable. He drank. He was handsome in the lean, predatory way of a man who has always been hungry. He was, by the deposition Jean herself made later, and by every other witness, a man who would do whatever Jean told him to do, and who would, between her instructions, get into fights and run up debts and disappear for weeks at a time. They moved into a small apartment in the Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles in the Marais. They presented themselves at Versailles. They were not received. This is the point at which most stories of this period end. Most provincial noblewomen of a doubtful line who marry below themselves and present themselves at court and are not received subside afterwards into a life of small visits, small debts, small grievances, and small obscurity. They die at 50 in Toulouse or Reims, and their letters are sold at auction in the next century for a few francs. Jean did not subside. She had, by the summer of 1783, when she was 27 and Marie Antoinette was 28, and the diamond collar in Boehmer's shop had been refused 3 times by the Queen, and Boehmer was beginning to write his careful, worried letters to Vienna about the interest. 2 things that no other failed Valois had ever had. She had, first, a story she had been telling herself since she was 7, the story of the road outside Bar-sur-Aube, and the carriage and the document, and the marquise, and the sheets and the dress, and the school and the pension, and the marriage, and the small apartment in the Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles. And the story had taught her with the precision of a long apprenticeship that the world was a machine which moved when one pulled the correct cord. And the correct cord was always, without exception, a man who needed to be made to believe that he was about to receive a gift. She had, second, the address of a man who had been writing to her since she was 23. He was 49. He was a cardinal. He was the Grand Aumônier of France. He had been refused entry to the Queen's private apartments for 10 years. He believed, on the evidence of certain letters he had received which began Marie Antoinette de France, and which were signed in the same hand, that the Queen had begun, very secretly, to forgive him. The letters were not from the Queen. They were from Jean. She had begun writing them in the spring of 1783 on paper she had purchased at the bookseller Crétet in the Rue de la Harpe, paper with no watermark, using a forger she had picked up in a wine shop near the Palais Royal, a former officer named Rétaux de Villette, who had been cashiered out of the gendarmerie for embezzlement, and who could write any hand he was shown for 2 louis a sheet. She had been writing them slowly. She had been pacing them. The cardinal had received 4 of them by the end of 1783. He kept them in a small lacquered box on his writing table at the Hôtel de Strasbourg in the Rue Vieille du Temple. He showed them to no one. He had begun by the end of that year to believe, and this is the thing on which everything afterwards depends, that he was the only man in France whom the Queen of France trusted enough to write to in secret. He was a prince of an old Alsatian house. He was the Prince Bishop of Strasbourg. He was the Grand Aumônier of France, which meant that he carried the gold-embroidered velvet cushion on which the King of France knelt at his coronation, and the gold-embroidered velvet cushion on which the King of France would, in due course, kneel at his confessor. He was a man of vast wealth, vast indulgence, and almost unlimited ambition. He had once given a dinner at the Hôtel de Strasbourg, at which the wine glasses were each cut from a single ruby. The dinner was real. The rubies, by the later report of his nephew, were Bohemian glass. But no one at the table had been told, and the impression had been correct, and the impression had been the point. He kept a private chemist, a Sicilian charlatan calling himself the Count of Cagliostro, who had taken a lease on a house in the Rue St. Claude in the Marais, and who held seances at which the dead spoke through a glass of water. The cardinal believed in Cagliostro, the way a man whose own gifts have outrun his understanding will believe in any man who tells him that the universe is, finally, comprehensible. He was, in every way that mattered for what Jean was about to do to him, the perfect mark. And she had not yet met him in person. By the end of 1783, she had only the letters. She wrote one more in January of 1784. She had it carried to him by a porter who had been paid in advance to wait for no reply and to refuse all questions. The letter was short. It said that the Queen would be willing at last to receive a small token of the cardinal's loyalty, a gift she could pretend was anonymous. The cardinal was to send no money. He was to send instead a letter of his own, sealed, addressed to Madame, and the Queen's confidant would carry it to her. The cardinal, on the morning of the day the letter arrived, wrote and sealed the letter. He gave it to the porter. He stood at the window of the Hôtel de Strasbourg and watched the porter cross the Rue Vieille du Temple and turn east. He did not eat for 2 days. He was, he said afterwards to his nephew, the happiest he had been in 12 years. He believed he had been forgiven. In fact, he had just delivered, into the hand of a woman he had never met, the first piece of paper she needed in order to ruin him, ruin the Queen of France, and break a diamond collar of 2,842 carats into pieces small enough to be sold one by one in the pawn shops of Hatton Garden. It would take her 18 months. The cardinal sat alone in his cabinet at the Hôtel de Strasbourg for the better part of 3 nights after the letter had gone, with a glass of Tokay he had stopped drinking, watching the candle burn down by inches, and tried to understand what had been given back to him. He was a man whose entire life had been arranged around the certainty that he was important. He had been born important. He had been baptized important. He had been promised the See of Strasbourg before he could read. And then, in the space of a single evening in Vienna in 1772, he had said one sentence at a table, a witticism about the partition of Poland and what he supposed the Empress Maria Theresa was telling herself about Catherine of Russia at her morning toilette. And a version of the remark had reached Paris within weeks, and Marie Antoinette, who was at that time the Dauphine and 17 years old, had decided that Cardinal de Rohan was the man she would not forgive. She did not forgive him. She would not receive him. For 10 years he had stood at the corner of every reception, every Te Deum, every diplomatic audience at which the Queen was present, and he had bowed when the Queen entered, and the Queen had not, on any of those 10 years of evenings, returned the bow. He was the Grand Aumônier of France. He carried by office the gold cushion on which the Queen knelt at Mass on certain feast days at the chapel at Versailles. The Queen knelt. The cardinal did not exist. I have stood at the entrance to the Hôtel de Strasbourg on the Rue Vieille du Temple. The gate is still there, with its stone griffin above the keystone worn nearly smooth, and through it you can see the courtyard which the cardinal had paved in pink Languedoc marble, at a cost which, by the report of his steward, would have built a country church. I do not know which of the upper windows was the cabinet in which he sat through those 3 nights. I know only that the man who sat there, on the strength of one short letter and the gilded seal which Jean had pressed onto the paper, using a copy of the Queen's privy seal which Rétaux de Villette had cut for her in a back room of the Rue de la Harpe, had decided that 10 years of silence were over. He wrote 3 days later to his old friend the Baron de Planta, his chamberlain, who was a Swiss and had served the cardinal since the embassy in Vienna, and who was the only living person to whom the cardinal said anything that he did not first say to a confessor. He wrote, "I have a friend at court, a friend I did not know I had. I shall need your discretion." Planta wrote in the margin of the letter, in his small, careful German hand, "Eminence, do not believe it." The cardinal did not, by his later admission at the trial, read the margin. He read only what he had written. Of Cardinal de Rohan, 4 things have to be said before this story can move on, because all 4 of them are what made him, for Jean, the perfect mark. He was a Rohan. The Rohans were one of the great houses of France, on the same rank as the Montmorencys and the La Trémoise, with a private motto, Roi ne puis, Prince ne daigne, Rohan suis, which meant, I cannot be king, I will not be a prince, I am a Rohan. He had been Grand Aumônier of France since 1777, which is the office that says Mass in the king's private chapel and gives the king his Easter communion. He was Prince Bishop of Strasbourg, which was an actual principality in Alsace with revenues, by the dossier later compiled for the trial, of around 400,000 livres a year. He was, by every account, including the depositions of his own household, a vain man. Not vain in the small, jealous way of an aging courtier. Vain in the structural way of a man who has been told from infancy that the universe was constructed in order to recognize him, and who has reached his 5th decade with one piece of evidence to the contrary, the Queen's averted face, and who has decided, on receipt of a sealed letter on cream-laid paper from a woman who has signed herself in a hand that resembles closely enough the Queen's, that the universe has finally completed its long, slow, formal apology. He was, or rather, by the spring of 1784, he was no longer, a man whom anyone in his household could warn. Planta had tried. The cardinal's nephew, the Prince de Soubise, had tried. His confessor, an old Capuchin from Saverne, who had known the cardinal since his ordination, had tried once and not tried again. The cardinal had begun to receive Jean in person in February of 1784 at the Hôtel de Strasbourg. She had presented herself, at his secretary's suggestion, in the salon at 4 in the afternoon, in a dove-gray gown turned at the cuffs, with her hair arranged in the simple manner she had been taught at Longchamp. I want to set down here, before describing the meeting between them, the woman Jeanne de la Motte was in that February. She was 28. She had been refused at court 3 times. She was living in a 4-room apartment in the Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles on a pension of 800 livres a year, which paid the rent and the bread and almost nothing else. Her husband had borrowed, in the previous 12 months, against her pension and against 3 pieces of plate that had belonged to the Marquise de Boulainvillier's daughter, who had given them as a wedding gift. The plate had been pawned at the Mont de Piété on the Rue des Blancs-Manteaux and not redeemed. Jean had begun, in the autumn of 1783, to receive a certain kind of man at her apartment in the afternoons. The men were introduced by her husband. The accounts of the police were never reduced to writing, but the deposition of the police officer who had been watching the apartment for an unrelated matter survived. And from that deposition it is clear that Jean, by the autumn of 1783, had begun to make a small and unsteady income from a particular kind of introduction. She had not yet, by the deposition itself, met a single person from the Queen's household. It is on this woman, clever, 28, exhausted, hungry, with a husband who would by 10 that evening be drinking himself stupid in a wine shop near the Place Royale, and with one document folded in oiled paper at the bottom of her dressing table drawer, that the Cardinal of France placed his bet. He received her in the salon at 4. He stood when she entered, which he had not done for any woman below the rank of Duchess in 11 years. He gave her his hand. He kissed her on both cheeks, which he had not done for any woman to whom he was not related in 15. He said, in French softened by his Alsatian boyhood, "Madame, I am told that I have a friend whom I should learn to recognize." Jean, who had practiced the next sentence in front of a small Venetian mirror in her bedroom for 11 evenings, said, "Eminence, you have a friend whom you already know, and who has at last asked me to bring you her regard." She had not named the Queen. She did not name the Queen. She would not name the Queen in any letter or any conversation until July of 1784. This was deliberate. She had read enough memoirs at the Marquise de Boulainvillier's house in Passy to understand that the most powerful thing one could give a vain man was the thing he would have to fill in for himself. The Cardinal filled it in. They sat down. Jean stayed an hour. The conversation that took place between them in that hour was reconstructed at the trial from 2 separate depositions. Jean's own, which was self-serving and partial, and the deposition of a lay brother who had been listening at a door in the antechamber and who, the records of the Lieutenant General of Police Crosney show, had been paid in advance by Planta to do exactly that. The depositions agree on the structure. Jean spoke of the Queen in the third person as a woman who had read certain papers and had begun to think the Cardinal had been treated unjustly. She spoke as if she had been with the Queen the night before, not in words, but in the small confidences which a woman drops into a conversation when she does not realize the listener is paying attention to the dropping. She named the Queen's habit of taking her petit déjeuner with a great deal of sugar. She named the way the Queen's spaniel slept under her writing table. She named the perfume, orange flower water with a thread of bergamot, which the Queen had begun to wear after the birth of the Dauphin. She named, in each case, things that she had heard from women who served other women who served the Queen. The kitchen lay sisters who carried away the Queen's chocolate cups, the laundresses of the Maison Bouche, the gardeners' wives at Trianon. By the end of the hour, the Cardinal believed that Jeanne de la Motte was admitted to the Queen's bedchamber on the strength of 3 or 4 visits a week. She was not. She had never been inside it. She had never crossed the threshold of any room at Versailles to which the Queen had been within 100 yards. The Cardinal asked at the end of the hour what he might do. Jean said, "Eminence, she wishes you to know that she remembers Vienna. She has not forgotten." She paused. She said, "Be patient, write nothing yet. Do not look for her at receptions, do not bow when she enters. She wishes you to behave as if you have given her up. She is, you understand, surrounded." The Cardinal stood up. He took her hand again. He said, "Madame, I am yours." Jean went home in a carriage that the Cardinal had insisted on placing at her disposal, and she sat in the carriage as it crossed the Pont Royal and looked at her own hands, and understood that she had become, in the space of 1 hour, a woman who could ask the Cardinal of France for money. She asked for none for 3 months. This was the most disciplined thing she ever did. She wrote later, in the memoir she published in London in 1789, a document one cannot read without irritation and without admiration in roughly equal parts, that she had understood that February that the Cardinal would give her eventually anything she could think to want, but only if she could prove to him that she did not want it. She wrote, he was a man who could be made to insist on being robbed. She let him insist. In May of 1784, after she had received him 3 times at her apartment in the Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles, which she had in the meantime refurbished on credit advanced by upholsterers who had been told that the lady was about to become very rich, the Cardinal sent her in a sealed packet a draft of 60,000 livres on his banker. The packet was accompanied by a note. "For the small charities you have spoken of, in the Queen's name." She had not spoken of any charities. She wrote back, accepting the draft, and listing, in a hand that resembled the Queen's, 6 recipients for the money, all of whom were real charitable institutions: a convent at Auteuil, a foundling hospital in Saint-Antoine, a school for the daughters of cavalry officers fallen in the American War. She made certain, by way of a single payment to a friendly canon at Auteuil, that the convent did in fact receive one of the donations, in case the Cardinal asked. The Cardinal did not ask. He did not for the entire 18 months between the May draft of 60,000 livres and his arrest on the steps of the chapel at Versailles in August of 1785, ask once for an accounting. He sent more. By the end of 1784, the cardinal had given Jean, in cash or in drafts on his banker Cerf Beer of Strasbourg, the sum of 120,000 livres. Almost none of it went to charity. Some of it went to her husband, who took a trip to England in the autumn of 1784, a trip whose purpose did not, at the time, appear to anyone. Some of it went to the upholsterer. Some of it went on a country house at Bar-sur-Aube, a small one, a former presbytery she had purchased for 14,000 livres, near the road where, 21 years earlier, the carriage of the Marquise de Boulainvilliers had stopped. She drove out to the house in May of 1784 with the deed in her reticule. She stood in front of it for a long time. She walked along the road afterwards. She did not, in her memoir or in any deposition, say what she had thought. I have been to Bar-sur-Aube. The verge of the road outside the town is grown over now, and the carriage track has been straightened, and the house Jean bought has been twice rebuilt. I do not know which step of which doorway she had been thinking of when she signed the deed. I know that she signed it, and that 2 months later, in July of 1784, she met for the first time the Sicilian who would, by his presence in the cardinal's antechamber on certain evenings of the following winter, give her the last thing she needed to bring down the Queen of France. His name, on the papers he carried, was Giuseppe Balsamo. The papers were false. His name, on the lease of the small house in the Rue Saint-Claude in the Marais, was the Count of Cagliostro. The lease was real. He was about 40. He was thick-set, dark, with a very heavy lower jaw and a voice which the Comtesse de Brionne, who heard him at a séance in the cardinal's house in October of 1784, described as the voice of a man who had once shouted across a market square and never quite forgotten how. He could read sealed letters by feeling them between his palms. He could cure the gout. He had, by the testimony of his own wife, been born of light in the Temple of Memphis 700 years ago. The cardinal believed all of it. Jean believed none of it. She watched Cagliostro at 3 of the cardinal's séances, in the long drawing room at the Hôtel de Strasbourg, where the Sicilian poured wine into a glass of water and called up the spirit of the cardinal's grandmother, who answered all questions in Italian, which the cardinal did not speak. Jean, who had a small, intelligent gift for spotting other operators, saw the wife of Cagliostro slip the Italian responses on small folded papers under the cardinal's wineglass. She saw the Sicilian palm the papers. She saw the cardinal's face afterwards, which was the face of a man who had received a message from his own dead grandmother, and who had not, for the duration of the message, breathed. She understood that she did not have to fight Cagliostro. She understood that Cagliostro was, for her purposes, a gift. As long as the Sicilian was in the cardinal's house feeding him spirit messages from his grandmother, the cardinal would not be capable of doubting any other message that came to him in a sealed letter from a woman he had been told was the Queen's confidant. She wrote in July a letter to the cardinal which was the first letter she sent under the Queen's name, and which she sealed with the false privy seal. The letter announced that the Queen, after long thought, had decided to entrust the cardinal with a delicate matter. The matter was so delicate that it could not be discussed in writing. It could be discussed only in person, at night, in the gardens at Versailles, with the Queen's confidant, Jean, present, and at a place of the cardinal's choosing within those gardens. The Queen would come veiled. She would speak only a few words. She would carry away from the meeting a small token, a rose, and would never afterwards refer to the meeting in any letter or any conversation. The cardinal read the letter 4 times. He stood at his window for an hour. He sent, in reply by the same porter, a single sentence on a folded sheet. Eminence is at the Queen's disposal in any garden of His Majesty's kingdom at any hour she pleases to set. Jean set the hour. She set the place. The hour was 11 o'clock at night on the 11th of August, 1784. The place was the Bosquet de Venus in the gardens of Versailles, a small clearing of yew hedge to the south of the orangery, in which a stone statue of Venus had stood since the time of Le Nôtre. The clearing was 20 paces by 20. It had 2 entrances. There was no light. There was, at that hour of an August night, No one in the gardens of Versailles except the king's guards, who were posted at the gates and not in the bosquets. She would need three things. She would need a woman of the queen's height and build, who could be made to wear something the cardinal would mistake for the queen's dress, and who could be made to say one sentence in a soft voice in the dark. She would need a way of getting that woman into the gardens of Versailles unobserved. She would need, by the morning after, every witness to be too compromised, too frightened, or too poorly placed to say what they had seen. She had, by mid-July of 1784, 26 days before the meeting. It was enough. Nicole Leguay was 28 years old and had been a working woman in Paris for 11 of them. She lived in a single room on the Rue du Jour, 2 streets from the Church of Saint Eustache, with a canary in a small cage and a colored print of the Annunciation she had taken from a stall on the Quai Voltaire when she was 22 and never been able to bring herself to throw away. She made between 4 and 6 livres a week. She was reckoned by the men who had seen her in the gardens of the Palais Royal on summer evenings to be one of the 3 or 4 women in Paris who, under candlelight, could be mistaken for the Queen of France. She had heard this said. She did not believe it. The Queen of France, by every account that had reached the Rue du Jour, was a woman of 28, slender, very pale, with a small mouth and pale blue eyes, and a particular tilt of the head that came from being told as a girl that her chin was a little long. Nicole was 28, slender, very pale, with a small mouth and pale blue eyes, and a particular tilt of the head which she had taught herself, in the same Venetian mirror in which Jean had practiced her sentences, to use when a man with money came into the room. A man with money came into her room on a Tuesday afternoon in late July of 1784. He was wearing a chestnut-brown coat and a wig she could see from 12 feet away had been freshly powdered. He gave his name as the Baron de Lannoy. His name was Rétaux de Villette, and he was the only man in Paris who could write Marie Antoinette's name in a hand that looked, in candlelight, identical to her own. He said, "Mademoiselle, I have an unusual proposition. I have been sent by a lady of the very highest rank. She wishes to play a small joke at the expense of a friend who has long deserved one. The friend is a man. He has long believed himself to be in the lady's affections. The lady wishes to disabuse him of this in a manner he will remember. She has chosen you because you, mademoiselle, resemble the lady more than any other woman in Paris." Nicole, who had heard a great many propositions and who knew the shape of one that hid something underneath it, said, "Who is the lady?" Villette said, "I am not at liberty." Nicole said, "Then I am not interested." Villette said, "The lady will pay you 15,000 livres." Nicole sat down on the edge of her bed. 15,000 livres was more money than she had ever held in her life. It was more money than she would, by any honest calculation, hold in the next 12 years of her trade. She said, eventually, "What does the lady want me to do?" Villette said, "Nothing. You will stand in a garden at night. A man will come up to you. He will kneel. He will kiss the hem of your dress. You will give him a rose. You will say one sentence which I will give you. You will turn and walk away. There will be a second lady with you, who will lead you away. You will not, that night or afterwards, say a word that has not been written for you." Nicole said, "And if I am caught?" Villette said, "By whom? The garden is private. The lady is, as I have said, of the very highest rank. She has the means to protect you. And mademoiselle, if you are caught, you will say only that you were paid by me, the Baron de Lannoy, and you will say it accurately. You will never have seen the lady. You will never have known her name." Nicole counted the canary's seed in her head. She counted the price of the print of the Annunciation, which had been 6 sous. She counted the cost of 3 months' rent on a 4-room apartment in the Rue Saint-Honoré, which she had walked past 12 times, and which she had never been able to afford. She said, "Bring me the money. I want to count it first." Villette brought 5,000 livres in advance that evening. The remaining 10,000 were to be paid the morning after. Nicole counted the 5,000 twice. She put them under the loose board beside the canary's cage. She lay awake until 3 in the morning. She thought, before she slept, about the lady at the very highest rank, and she understood, with the clarity which fear gives to the back of the brain, that there was only one woman in France to whom that description could apply, and that the joke on a man who had long deserved one was therefore being played on a man whose name and rank she did not want to know. She slept then and dreamed, by the deposition she gave 18 months later in the Bastille, that the canary had been let out of its cage and had flown away. On the 11th of August at 9 in the evening, Villette came in a hired chaise to fetch her. She was wearing a robe of pale rose taffeta, which Jean had purchased that morning from a milliner in the Rue Saint-Honoré, and which had been altered to fit Nicole's height in the course of 4 hours by two seamstresses Jean had paid in coin. The robe was a copy, not the Queen's actual style, but the style she had been seen wearing in two engravings the public had bought that summer. The Gaul, a simple muslin so unstructured that it had been criticized in the gazettes as inappropriate to her dignity. Jean had chosen it on purpose. The criticism would make the Cardinal believe the Queen had come dressed to be unrecognized. The chaise drove west out of Paris through the night. They did not stop at any village. At Versailles, they entered the gardens by a service gate beside the orangery, which had been left unlocked by a gatekeeper to whom Jean's husband had paid 2 louis the previous afternoon. The bribe was never traced. The gatekeeper was never named, and at the trial, when the prosecution tried to identify him from the duty roster of August 11th, it was found that the relevant page had been removed. Jean met them at the gate. She was wearing a black domino over a black gown, with her hair under a black hood. She was carrying, in a gloved hand, a single white rose, which she had cut from a hedge at the corner of the Rue des Reservoirs an hour earlier. She gave the rose to Nicole. She gave Nicole the sentence. The sentence was, "Vous savez ce que cela veut dire." You know what this means. Nicole repeated it twice. They walked together along the gravel path past the basin of Apollo, where the fountains were dry at that hour, and the marble of the chariot was visible like the bones of something dead. They turned south at the Dragon Basin. They entered the Bosquet de Venus by its east entrance. The clearing was, as Jean had reconnoitered it twice in the last week, 20 paces by 20. The yew hedge had been clipped in May. The statue of Venus stood in the center on a low plinth. There was no light except the moon, which was 3 nights from full, and which came in through the open south end of the clearing in a flat silver wash that made the hedges black. Jean placed Nicole at the south end, in the moon. She withdrew herself to a position at the east entrance behind a yew. She waited. The Cardinal came in alone, on foot, by the west entrance. He had left his carriage at the Petite Écurie, at the cost of a louis to the chief groom for silence. He was wearing a plain black coat over his cassock, his cross at his breast, his ring on his finger, and a wide-brimmed hat. He paused at the entrance to the clearing. He saw the figure in pale rose against the moon. He removed his hat. He approached slowly until he was 5 paces from her. He sank, by the deposition he gave 18 months later, before the Parliament of Paris, under the most careful interrogation that body had ever conducted, onto one knee. He bent forward. He reached out with his right hand and took the edge of the rose taffeta gown between his fingers and pressed it to his lips. Nicole, who had been told to extend her hand with the rose, extended her hand with the rose. The Cardinal took the rose. He looked up. She said, in a voice she had practiced in the carriage and which was, in the dark, no more than a whisper, "Vous savez ce que cela veut dire?" She turned. She walked away. Jean came out of the yew. Jean took her elbow. They left by the east entrance. They did not run. They walked, by Jean's later account in her memoir, as one walks away from an altar. The Cardinal, by his deposition, did not move from the place where he had knelt for what he afterwards calculated had been 7 or 8 minutes. He stood, eventually. He took the rose with him. He left by the west entrance. He drove back to Paris in his carriage and reached the Hôtel de Strasbourg at 4 in the morning. He went into his cabinet. He placed the rose in a cup of water beside the small lacquered box in which he kept the Queen's letters. He sat at his writing table. He could not, by his own account, write. He could not afterwards sleep. He went, at 6, to early Mass at the Carmelite chapel at the corner of the Rue Vaugirard, and he said the Mass himself, before any of his household had risen. I have read the Baron de Bougnot's account of this night 3 times. Bougnot was Jean's distant cousin, raised with her in Champagne, who had visited her in Paris in the spring of 1785, and to whom she had described, by the small, uncareful pride of a woman explaining how she had outwitted a man whose hat she had once been afraid to brush against, what she had done at the Bosquet de Venus. The second time I read his account, the postscript made me cold. Huguenot had stood for a long time at his window after she had left, and he had understood, this is his sentence, in the memoirs published in 1866, that she did not know yet what she had done. She thought she had laughed at a cardinal. She had pulled down that night the whole house of cards. She did not see, because she had never been allowed close enough to a king or a queen to see, that you do not laugh at the Queen of France in the gardens of Versailles, even when the queen is not there. The Queen of France is in those gardens even when she is in Trianon. The gardens themselves are the queen. Jeanne, by her own memoir, did not see this for another 6 months. What she saw for 6 months was that the cardinal would now do anything she asked. He would do it without question. He would do it gratefully. She tested this carefully through the autumn of 1784. She asked him to advance her a further 40,000 livres for a small estate in Picardy, which she had been told the queen had requested be acquired for the use of a discreet former lady-in-waiting. The cardinal advanced the 40,000 livres in 2 payments. The estate did not exist. She bought herself, with part of the money, a carriage with the arms of the Valois painted on the doors, and a pair of bay mares from Limoges, and a livery of yellow and silver for her 2 footmen. She drove through the Bois de Boulogne in the carriage in October. She was seen by the Comtesse de Brienne, who afterwards wrote to her cousin, "There is a person at present in Paris who pretends to the name Valois, and who drives in a carriage and lives in a manner which puzzles me. I have heard that she has the ear of a great person. I do not believe it." The great person whose ear Jean now had was about to be asked for something rather larger than 40,000 livres. In December of 1784, Boehmer the jeweler, who had now been carrying the necklace for 11 years and whose interest payments had eaten so far into his accounts that he had begun to write begging letters to anyone who might know how to reach the queen, was approached at the Quai des Orfèvres by a woman who told him she was the Comtesse de la Motte Valois, and that she had been sent by the queen herself, who had at last changed her mind about the necklace and wished to acquire it through an intermediary, in secret, because she could not afford the political cost of being seen to spend 1,600,000 livres in public. Boehmer, who was a careful man and who had been deceived by women before, but never by women carrying letters with the queen's privy seal, asked for the letter. The letter was produced. It was on cream-laid paper. It was sealed with what looked, in candlelight, like the queen's seal. It was signed Marie Antoinette de France. Boehmer afterwards explained, in the deposition he gave to the Lieutenant General of Police in August of 1785, that the signature had troubled him for half a minute, and then had stopped troubling him, because the woman speaking was so calm and so detailed and so plausibly informed about the small private business of the court that he had not seen how she could be other than what she said. She told him the queen wished to buy the necklace for 1,600,000 livres. She wished to pay in 4 installments of 400,000 each, every 6 months, beginning the 1st of August, 1785. She wished the intermediary to be the Cardinal de Rohan, whose name would appear on the contract as guarantor, and to whom Boehmer was to deliver the necklace on the 1st of February, 1785. Boehmer asked if he could speak to the cardinal. She said, "Yes, tonight." The cardinal received Boehmer that evening at the Hotel de Strasbourg. The cardinal confirmed every word Jean had said. The cardinal signed the contract Boehmer had drawn up. The cardinal said, "I act on the queen's express command. Her signature in the margin is the surety. You will not, of course, refer to the matter in public, nor at court, nor in writing to any party not in this room." Boehmer signed. He sold his most valuable physical asset on the strength of one signature in a margin and the word of a prince of the church. He delivered the necklace in a flat leather case to the Hotel de Strasbourg on the 1st of February, 1785. The cardinal signed the receipt. The cardinal carried the case himself into his cabinet. Within an hour, the case had been handed by the cardinal to Jean, who was waiting in an antechamber, and who had told the cardinal that the queen had instructed that the necklace was to be conveyed to her personal apartments by Jean herself, accompanied by a discreet servant of the queen's household, who was to remain in the carriage at the door of the Hotel de Strasbourg. There was no discreet servant of the queen's household. The man waiting in the carriage was Rétaux de Villette. They drove not to Versailles, but to the Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles. Inside the apartment, on the dining table, in front of Marc-Antoine de la Motte and Rétaux de Villette, Jean opened the case. The necklace lay on its white silk. 647 stones, 2,842 carats. The largest single stone, the central drop, weighing 11 and an eighth carats, and described by Bassange afterwards as fine a brilliant as has ever been cut in Antwerp. Marc-Antoine de la Motte, who was, in the deposition he later gave in absentia from London, a man of no particular imagination, said, "Is that all of it?" Jean said, "We break it tonight." She had purchased, 3 weeks earlier, a small jeweler's hammer and a pair of pliers from a stall on the Quai Voltaire. The hammer was for the silver settings. The pliers were for the rivets. They worked through the night. The silver was bagged up into a sack. The stones were sorted by size into 7 small leather pouches. By 6 in the morning, the necklace had ceased to exist as a necklace. It had become, and I am taking these figures from the inventory the Lieutenant General of Police later compiled in August, 3 pouches of brilliants, of which the largest stones had been entered into a small private notebook in Jean's hand for sale in London, and 4 pouches of smaller stones, which Marc-Antoine carried with him on the boat from Calais to Dover on the 4th of February, 1785. He landed at Dover on the morning of the 5th. He took rooms at the Star and Garter on Pall Mall in London on the 7th. By the 10th, he was visiting jewelers in Hatton Garden and offering the smaller stones in lots, never more than 10 at a time, never named to a single buyer. By the end of February, he had sold the contents of the 4 smaller pouches at heavy discount to the trade, far below what the cut stones had been worth to a court jeweler, but enough to set up a man with no need to account to anyone. He sold the larger stones over the following 4 months. He drank, he kept a woman in lodgings in Soho, he sent Jean by the postal service through Holland a letter saying that the work was proceeding satisfactorily and that the prices were lower than expected. Jean, in Paris, lived through that spring on a fortune. She ordered 3 new gowns from the dressmaker Bertin, who also dressed the Queen, and was received at Bertin's salon with the consideration due to a wealthy provincial countess of doubtful origin. She bought a country house in Bar-sur-Aube, a second one, larger than the first. She moved into a new apartment in the Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles. She continued to receive the Cardinal in the afternoons, and she continued to bring him verbal messages from the Queen, who had still not, in any reception, in any chapel, returned the Cardinal's bow. The Cardinal began in April to ask when the first payment on the necklace would be due. The first installment of 400,000 livres was due on the 1st of August. Jean said the Queen had assured her that the funds would be available. The Cardinal asked the same question in May. Jean said the same thing. The Cardinal asked again in June. Jean, who had spent in 3 months almost everything Marc-Antoine had sent her from London, said the Queen would speak to the Comptroller General that month. The 1st of August arrived. There was no payment. The Cardinal, who had told Böhmer that he, the Cardinal, would not pay the installment from his own funds because he was merely the Queen's agent, sat in his cabinet at Versailles and waited for word from Jean. Word did not come. Jean was in Bar-sur-Aube. Marc-Antoine was in London. Rétaux de Villette was in Geneva, where he had been sent with the largest of the stones, 2 of around 8 carats, which were too distinctive to sell in London. In the first days of August, Böhmer, who had not been paid and whose creditors were beginning to write the kind of letters one cannot keep in a drawer, sought out Madame Campan at Versailles. He had known her for years. By Campan's own account in her memoirs, he came to her with a story and a small note in the Queen's hand, which he had been told would explain everything. Madame Campan, who had served the Queen for 13 years and who was a woman of extreme practical intelligence, listened. By the end of their conversation, she had said in substance, "Monsieur, the Queen has not bought your necklace. The Queen has not seen the Cardinal. The Queen has not signed the contract. You are the victim of a crime which has been committed under her name." Böhmer fainted on the carpet of Madame Campan's antechamber. The Queen was told that afternoon. The King was told that evening. The Cardinal is arrested in his full vestments in the Galerie des Glaces on the morning of the 15th of August, the Feast of the Assumption. At the moment he was about to celebrate Mass in the King's presence. He was taken to the Bastille that night. Jean, in Bar-sur-Aube, was arrested on the 18th. The collar had ceased to exist 7 months earlier. The cardinal had not seen one stone of it since the 1st of February. The queen had not seen one stone of it ever. Beaumer had not been paid 1 livre. And Marie Antoinette of Austria, Queen of France, who was at that moment 30 years old and the mother of 3 living children, had 8 years left before her own neck would feel the weight of her own collar of plain rope on the morning of the 16th of October, 1793. The trial began the following spring. In the cell to which she had been moved on the eve of the verdict, on the 30th of May, 1786, in a corner of the conciergerie that had been used for 140 years for prisoners whose families could pay for sheets, Jean sat on the edge of her cot, in a plain gray gown that the warden's wife had given her, and she counted in a small notebook she had been permitted to keep the things she still owned. The list was short. She owned the gown. She owned a small ivory comb that the warden's wife had also given her. She owned the prayer book Madame de Boulainvilliers had given her when she was 13, which she had been allowed to keep through her arrest because it had been found inside the prayer book, where she also kept, folded twice, a piece of gilded ribbon she had been carrying since 1763. She owned, by the small black accounting which only she now knew, 341 days of intelligent invention, beginning with the letter in January 1784 and ending with the morning of her arrest in Bar-sur-Aube. She owned, at 29 years and 10 months, the certainty that she had been the only person in France clever enough to do what she had done, and that she would be the only person in France who would pay for it. The cardinal was tried by the Parlement of Paris in the Great Chamber on the morning of the 31st of May. He came in his vestments. He came accompanied by 28 of his Rohan kinsmen, every one of them in full court mourning, who stood in 2 rows in the gallery and stared down at the magistrates of the Parlement in a silence which the deposition of one of the magistrates later described as the silence of an army preparing to remember a slight. The Parlement of Paris was not the king's court. It was an independent body, hereditary, jealous of its prerogatives, and at that particular moment, in the middle of 1786, locked in 3 years of constitutional war with the king's minister Calonne over the financial crisis. The trial of the cardinal had been forced upon it. The king had wanted the cardinal tried in secret by a royal commission, which would have produced, on the king's instruction, a verdict of guilty and a quick administrative banishment to the cardinal's own diocese. The cardinal had insisted, by right as a peer of France, on his case being heard by the Parliament. The king had not been able to refuse. The Parliament had received the file with the precise pleasure of a magistrate handed a stick with which to beat the man holding him at bay. They acquitted the cardinal 26 votes to 23. They declared him innocent of any criminal intent. They declared further that the letters he had received purporting to be from the queen were forgeries, that the meeting in the gardens of Versailles had been a sham produced by a known criminal of doubtful aristocracy, and that the cardinal, while gullible to a degree astonishing in a prince of the church, had been the victim and not the agent of the crime. The verdict, by the depositions of the next several days from the streets of Paris and the dispatches of Mercy Argenteau to Vienna, was received by the city with the noise of a public festival. Crowds gathered on the Pont Neuf. Songs were sung. The cardinal, on emerging from the conciergerie at midnight on the 1st of June, was carried to the Place Royale on the shoulders of fishwives. He was the most popular man in Paris. The queen, who had been waiting in her apartments at Versailles for the verdict, was told at 2 in the morning by Madame Campan herself. She sat down on a small gilded sofa and wept for an hour without speaking. She then stood up and said, by the substance of what Campan and Mercy Argenteau preserved, that the Parlement had not acquitted a cardinal, it had acquitted the necklace, and in acquitting him, had declared that the country believed her capable of the thing. She walked to the window. She did not, for the remainder of the night, sleep. She had 8 years. She did not know she had 8 years. She believed she had a marriage and 3 children, and a continent to whose sovereigns she would, in due course, be referred for protection. She had 8 years. Jean was sentenced separately on the morning of the 31st of May. Her sentence was read in the Great Chamber, after the cardinal had been carried out. She was found guilty of having forged the queen's signature, of having defrauded the cardinal of the necklace, of having attempted to defraud the queen of her reputation, and of having sold the proceeds of the crime abroad. The sentence was the maximum the Parliament could impose on a woman. She was to be whipped, branded on both shoulders with the letter V for voleuse, and committed to the prison of the Salpêtrière for the term of her natural life. She was carried to the conciergerie that night. The sentence was to be executed on the steps of the conciergerie at 6 the following morning, in front of any spectators who chose to attend, in the manner customary for thieves of the kingdom. I have read the family record of the executioner of Paris, Charles-Henri Sanson, who was that year in his 40s and who would, in 7 years and 4 months, also be the executioner of Marie Antoinette on the 16th of October, 1793. Sanson's account of the morning of the 1st of June, 1786 survives, in a polished form, in the papers his descendants afterwards collected. It should be read with some care, but the spine of his memory of that morning has not, in my reading, been undone by later research. He had been told that the prisoner would be brought down at 6. He arrived at 5. He inspected the steps. He instructed his assistant to heat the iron. The iron, by his account, was a flat iron with a raised letter V at the tip, 3 inches by 3 inches, of a kind that had been used in the kingdom since the Ordinance of St. Louis. It was heated red. It was set into a brazier of coals on the step. Jeanne came out of the door of the conciergerie at 20 minutes past 6. She was wearing the gray gown. She had refused, the deposition of the chaplain says, to be confessed. She was held at either elbow by 2 of the warden's men. She did not, by Sanson's account, weep. She walked to the place which had been marked for her with a piece of chalk. She turned to face the small crowd which had assembled at the bottom of the steps, perhaps 400 people, almost all of them women. Sanson said, "Madame, expose your shoulder." She did not move. He said, "Madame, by the order of the court, expose your shoulder." She did not move. He nodded to his assistant. The assistant tore the gown at the right shoulder. Sanson took the iron from the brazier with a pair of long tongs. Jeanne, by the deposition Sanson gave 40 years later, then did the thing for which she was remembered in Paris for the rest of that century. She turned her face up to the iron. She did not scream. She bit, by Sanson's account, the inside of her own cheek. The iron was applied to the right shoulder for 2 seconds. The smell of it, Sanson said, was the smell which one never forgot. She was supposed to be branded on both shoulders. As Sanson moved to apply the iron to the left, she twisted, by the violence of her own body, away from the man holding her left elbow, and the iron fell against her left breast. She screamed once. The brand was not applied a second time. The chaplain, by his deposition, was sick on the lower step. She was carried into a closed cart and driven to the Salpêtrière. The cart, in the Rue Saint-Honoré, was followed by a crowd of 300 or 400 people who, by the dispatches of the police that day, were divided between those who shouted that the Queen ought to have been on the cart and those who shouted that no woman of any kind ought to have been branded in public in front of children. The brand on Jeanne's left breast healed badly and was still visible at her autopsy in 1791. She was held in the Salpêtrière for 1 year and 4 days. She was given a cell on the upper floor, away from the general dormitories. She was permitted writing materials. She was permitted visitors. She received, in the course of that year, 2 visitors of consequence. Madame de Boulainvillier's daughter, who had been her almost sister at the house in Passy, and who came to bring her the linen and small money the family had collected, and Beugnot, the cousin from Champagne, who came twice, and who left her, the second time, with the address of a relative of his wife who kept a stationer's shop in Pall Mall in London, and who could be relied upon to act, if anything should ever happen, as a discreet first contact. She escaped on the 5th of June, 1787. The escape was, by the police report, of so obvious a kind that it must have been arranged in advance by someone within the establishment. She was let out by a turnkey who had been paid. The turnkey was never named. She was driven to Le Havre. From Le Havre, she sailed on the 8th of June on a smuggler's brig to Newhaven on the south coast of England, and from Newhaven by coach to London. She arrived in London on the 14th of June with a forged passport in the name of the Comtesse de Gachet, which she had been given by Beugnot's contact at the stationer's shop, and which got her past the immigration officers at the port without comment. She did not see her husband. Marc-Antoine had by that time gone through the proceeds of the necklace in the manner of a man who has come into a fortune by no work of his own, and who therefore values it at less than its cost. He was living in a small house in Soho with a different woman from the one of 1785. He had become a heavy drinker. When Jean arrived in London, he refused, by the account of the woman with whom he was living, to receive her. They never lived together again. He drifted afterwards between London and Paris. The records of his last years are uneven, and the family tradition that he died in obscurity in the early 90s is not, I think, to be relied on. Jeanne lived in London on the small money Beugnot's relative had advanced her. She moved in the autumn of 1787 to a set of rooms on the second floor of a house on Sloane Street, where she was looked after by a Frenchwoman of her own age who had emigrated in 1785. She began, in the winter of 1787, to write her memoirs. The memoirs were published in 3 volumes in London in 1789, in French, under the title Mémoires justificatifs de la Comtesse de Valois de la Motte. They were a self-serving lie. They claimed that Jeanne had been the Queen's intimate friend, that the Queen had ordered her to procure the necklace, and that the Cardinal had been the Queen's lover. The memoirs were translated into English within the year. They were translated into German within 2. They were read all over Europe. They were read in particular by every revolutionary writer in Paris between 1789 and 1793. The Queen, by the memoirs of her own household, was made aware week by week of which printings of the memoirs were appearing where, and of which pamphleteers were citing them in which papers. She was told, in the summer of 1791, that Jean had published a further volume. She put the volume into the fire of her writing room at the Tuileries without opening it. The chambermaid who had handed it to her watched her do it. I have read the Memoirs Justificatifs through twice. They are, as documents, mostly fabrication. They are, as a weapon, almost perfect. They were the slow, continuous poison that ran under Marie Antoinette's neck for the 4 years between the necklace trial and the morning of October 16, 1793. Every pamphleteer who later called her l'Autrichienne, who later accused her of incest with her son, who later claimed that she had spent the treasury on her own clothes, every one of them had read Jeanne's memoirs and had borrowed from them and was, in a sense, working at the rate Jeanne had set. On the night of the 23rd of June, 1791, that is 3 nights after the King and Queen had attempted